Hello, and welcome to a Glastonbury romance. Not a Canterbury romance, a Glastonbury romance. If you want the Canterbury romance, that's another channel. The presence of Sally in the house, Mrs. Jeard would hardly allow her to cross the threshold of her sacred kitchen, was one of the few tokens of domestic grandeur that had appeared in Cardiff Villa, Street Road, since Johnny Gurd's ascension to wealth. And Sally, a daughter of Mrs. Jones of the High Street tea shop, was anything but a smart or experienced servant. But Cordelia was rather relieved not to be perpetually answering the doorbell, and sometimes, when in one of her bad moods she was lying supine on her bed upstairs, she did get a faint, malicious satisfaction in hearing Sally repeat her most difficult lesson, the inhospitable decree, not at home. Bloody Johnny, as the tavern cronies in Glastonbury loved to call Mr. Jeard because of his preachings in the street and his repeated reference to the blood of Christ, was evidently not intended to use William Crow's money for the embellishing of Cardiff Villa either, with new paint, or furniture, or plate, or servants. Cordelia wondered now, as they entered the kitchen and found Sally Jones staring mute and awestruck before Mrs. Jeard's preparations, whether Mr. Evans realized yet how unlikely it was that any large portion of this money would come to her, even if she did marry him. Never, never did any man want taking care of more than Mr. Evans does, she thought. Oddly enough, she never thought of her antiquarian suitor as anything but Mr. Evans. She had reached the point, no very easy point considering the ponderousness of the Welshman's second manner, of calling him Owen, but she never thought of him as Owen. Next scene. I really brought Mr. Crow to see you, said Mr. Evans, referring to John Crow, as they all sat around the tea tray in the front parlor, because he's in difficulties. At the word difficulties, Megan Gaird's mouth closed tight, and she glanced furtively at the preposterously big skull of her reckless husband. She had known too well, and only too recently, what to be in difficulties meant. But Bloody Johnny seemed to have no such memory. He turned his hypercephalic head on the pivot of his neck, with the slow gravity of the ghost in Punch and Judy, and gazed at John across the table. Your grandfather was a good friend to me, he remarked, but I served him well. If you'll excuse the word, Mr. Crow, and not think me presumptuous, I believe I can say that I made your grandfather's last years very happy ones. John reduced his eyes to two narrow slits. Through these apertures he scrutinized Mr. Gurd very closely, giving him the appraising glance of a professional beggar surveying a new countenance of a well-known back door. What I don't think is understood by any of your family, Mr. Crow, the ex-preacher went on, is that I regard your grandfather's bequest in the light of a divine responsibility. At the sound of these surprising words from his host and namesake, John Crow's eyes almost closed entirely, while the hereditary twitch in his face became like a tiny jumping jack under the skin of his lean cheek. You mean you're going to give the oof back to us, sir? He said. Bloody Johnny was the only person at that table who remained completely at ease under the shock of this rude speech. Well, Mr. Crow, he remarked serenely, not exactly give it back to you, nor to any of you. Not that it is exactly as you might say, give it back. But I do intend, and my friend Mr. Evans agrees entirely with my intention, to spend your dear grandfather's gift, or at least the bulk of it, on a purpose in no way connected with myself or with my family. Mr. Gaird's voice raised itself a little as he uttered these final words, and his great head seemed to obey an interior command as it swung resolutely round on its pivot. What it faced now under this interior command, and John Crow seemed to hear an audible creaking of its machinery as it turned, was the extremely agitated countenance of Megan Gaird, whose mouth, at the words, with my family, had become a thinly outlined half-circle whose drooping horns were surrounded by twitching wrinkles. Mr. Evans thinks, went on Bloody Johnny, that it would be wrong of me not to take my wife and my girls, especially my daughter Cordelia, into my confidence, though, as you know, my treasure," here he fixed an unwinking gaze upon his wife's wide-open eyes, "I am not one to reveal my designs till they have matured." The reverberations of these grand words, designs, and matured, had scarcely died away when Bloody Johnny followed them by a deprecatory murmur, addressed not to his family but to his God. "I mean," he added, "till they have been blessed from above." A lackluster film formed over John's eyes, and he said to himself, "If this fellow turns out to be a superstitious fool instead of a hypocritical knave, I shall get nothing from him. There goes my easy job up in smoke." "My relative, Mr. Gurd," said Miss Owen Evans, with a respectable glance at Cordelia, "has come to the conclusion that there are ways of bringing to Glastonbury, by the wise expenditure of a little money, shoals and shoals of pilgrims. They will come from France, from Germany, from Russia. They will flock here in such increasing numbers that Glastonbury will once more rival Rome and Jerusalem as a center of mystic influence. It only remains for..." At this point, to Cordelia's complete astonishment, though she thought, as she had said to Crummy, that she knew Mr. Evans through and through, his gaze dropped from her attentive eyes and sank to her clasped hands, which rested on the table, while his voice became broken, spasmodic, intense. For some event to happen, and a new religion, different from any that's ever been, will make a crack in the world. They all turned their eyes upon his contorted face, all except Crummy, who glanced wonderingly at her sister. "What do you mean by crack in the world?" inquired John Crow, the film of hopelessness passing from his lineaments and his whole attention aroused. "A crack of cause and effect," cried Owen Evans, his voice rising. "A crack in the laws of nature, a crack in matter. And something will break out through that crack that will take away our torment." The word torment was uttered with such twisted lips that it was as if it really came from a spirit in hell, and Cordelia Guard's heart began to beat. The others, except the profane John, averted their eyes as if from some apparition that was as obscene as it was tragic. But as Owen Evans slowly recovered himself, the girl unclasped her hands, and very lightly, and with a gesture that no gentlewoman in the land could have surpassed for dignity and grace, laid her fingers on the sleeve of his coat. John, who was intensely watching Mr. Evans, could not decide whether the man even noticed this movement of the devoted girl, whose fingers were withdrawn as soon as her friend was master of himself again, but to the sly scrutiny of the run-down adventurer, the incident was very significant. "He's not out for her money," he thought, "but he's certainly out of her depth. I must get at the fellow's secret. He's got some devilish spike sticking into his midriff, but what it is, the Lord only knows." As for John Gurd, under this explosion from this Welsh ally, what he did was slowly and deliberately to turn, not his head, but his eyes, in their hollow, motionless sockets, completely away from the agitated man. Mr. Gurd had his mouth full of sponge cake, of which he was particularly fond, and his voice sounded blurred and thick. "What we ought to have in Glastonbury," he said, "and midsummer would be a good time for it, is a religious fair or passion play that would attract people. There's not been a passion play here for years." He paused and shut his eyes. "Nor a miracle either," he muttered. "No, not for 300 years. But the time will come, and the miracle will come." It was at that moment that Crummy, who was much more aware of what Sally was doing than of what any of her father's guests were saying, jumped up from her seat and ran into the kitchen. From the kitchen, from the impulsive girl left the door wide open, everyone could hear her scolding the little maid for inattention. It was clear from the first words that ensued that Crummy found the domestic truant standing in Street Road contemplating the passers-by. But a moment later they heard Crummy's own voice raised in lively salutation. Sally herself came back, shamefacedly enough, into the dining room and whispered something to Cordelia. Well, there was such a draught of chilly air entering the room now that Mr. and Mrs. Gird and their two male guests kept their faces turned and their attention directly towards the two open doors. "It's young Mr. Decker," said Cordelia presently. "I know his voice." At the name Decker, there occurred that curious moral stiffening, that gathering together of relaxed social awareness, which always happens in England when an upper-middle-class person enters the company of a group of lower-middle-class persons. Cordelia had hardly uttered the words, "I know his voice," then Crummy herself came back into the room, bringing Sam Decker with her. There was a general rising and shuffling and shaking of hands. In the midst of the confusion, while Sally was pouring lukewarm water upon stale tea leaves, Cordelia slipped into the kitchen and began to make a fresh pot of tea and to cut fresh bread and butter. Sam Decker sat down, awkwardly enough, by Crummy's side. Here he was at the end of the table, next to Mrs. Gird, but also next to the door. He refused to put down his hat and stick and kept protesting that he must not stay and that he had already had tea. "Oh, Cordy, how nice of you to think of that," cried the younger sister, when after a few nervous generalities about the balmy morning and the chilly evenings of this unusual March, the ice was broken by the appearance of a fresh tea and fresh bread and butter. Sam did now consent to allow Crummy to take his hat and his stick away from him. He had begun to look at John Crow with a stealthy, silent, lowering curiosity, as if John had been a fellow badger in a gathering of foxes. "May I tell you, Mr. Decker," John now found himself saying, "about the grand plot that you two gentlemen are hatching to make this place a sort of English Aberamarangu? Aberamaragu? I don't know what that is. Look it up in a minute." "I could hardly hope," remarked Mr. Gird, with an impeccable nod of approval towards John, "to convert Mr. Decker to my immature design, considering the position held by his father. Mr. Gird has the idea," John went on, addressing himself now to Sam Decker alone, "of holding a sort of pageant, a sort of religious fair at midsummer. I believe he has the 24th of June in his mind, in the Tor Farfield, sir? His idea is to make this such an event that people will come to it from France and Germany as well as from all over England. It will, of course, be entirely friendly to all religious bodies. It won't be a church affair, and won't be a nonconformist affair. It'll be... I'm right in this, aren't I, Mr. Gird? A Glastonbury revival, absolutely independent of the churches. I can see your interest in the idea, Mr. Decker, and so will everybody be when we've got it all advertised a little. Oh, I wish you'd make me your secretary, sir, or your master of ceremonies, anything of that sort. I know I catch exactly what you have in your mind. And it would hush up all the gossip, too, and look well in the papers if you had one of us crows as your chief lieutenant. And incidentally, 'twould give me a chance to," he was going to say, "to upset Philip." But as he surveyed Bloody Johnny's face, he recognized that malice towards an enemy was completely alien to the man's nature, so he concluded differently. "A chance to marry and settle down. I can see you're surprised, Mr. Decker, to see me here at all, considering my family's grievances against Mr. Gird, and our envy and our jealousy of Mr. Gird. But I'm a black sheep, you know. I don't mind confessing to all you kind people." Here he raised his voice and glanced at the round, red, hypnotized face of the mad maid Sally, who, standing behind Mr. Gird's chair, had long since been hanging upon his lips with as much attention as if he had been the human chimpanzee talking in the magic booth at Somerton's circus. "Then I came here hoping that Mr. Gird would let me help him in some way. I even thought that his employment of me would act as a hush money to all this gossip. A sop to Cerberus, as you might say. But Mr. Gird reads my thoughts. You know, you do, sir. Yes, you really do." Well, John Crow's up to a little conniving there, isn't he? That's interesting. We're starting to get a little plot, too, which is nice. Let's look up this word now, shall we? 1 second. It's always good to look up words we don't know. It is Obermaringu. Manguru. Oh, there's one in 2020. It is it's a passion play. It's a traditional one since 1634 in Germany. So it's a German word. Obermangu. Obermargu. Well, maybe some of our wonderful German listeners out there will tell me how to pronounce it properly. Anyway, until next time,